Hello out there, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It is the Saturday live stream, and I know that because it isn't yet Sunday. But what it is the first live stream since the election ended, and it ended on time, unlike some streams. But and there's loads of analysis on this platform and on others about what happened. But there's something in particular that caught my eye. Now, I did a video before the election about which musicians endorsed which candidates in 2024 and which musicians endorsed which candidates going back all the way to 1960 when Frank Sinatra and his pals got strongly behind JFK. Now, the list was relatively balanced in terms of numbers, but in terms of record sales and more appropriately streaming numbers, Kamala Harris had the edge. So we can say that it's not a decisive thing. Having people like Taylor Swift and Beyonce, the two biggest musical acts of the last 20 years, on your side, isn't enough to swing an election. But a lot of people are commenting further, and they're saying that people no longer really care what big pop stars, what big musicians have to say. And that got me thinking not so much about politics itself, but the nature of the music industry, music's place in society, and the overall history of why, when, and how people want to hear from musicians when they're not singing or playing an instrument. Gotta stay hydrated. So, um, prior to the age of mass communication, and moreover, before the age of the commercialization of music, very few people cared what a musician said. They were hired guns. They played in churches, they played for the wealthy, for the aristocratic types, and that was it. But lyricism, apart from musical performance, has always been a way to communicate. I mentioned that the origin of poetry was less in art than it was in utility. Poetry was a way of delivering information, whether that information was the news about a war or a politician's death, or an opinion of a great philosopher or orator. Just think of Homeric poetry in ancient Greece. It was a means of communicating a story. Look at the Iliad. It was information about the Trojan War. And so that held its purpose well up through the invention of the printing press. And poetry, of course, is just lyrics without a musical accompaniment. So we can see that when it comes to lyricism, the very poetic roots of lyrics are all about the dissemination of information and the dissemination of opinion. So we'll get back to lyrics in a moment. But what about musicians communicating their opinions outside of anything musical or lyrical? Well, that really only started to happen in an important way in the age when music became a commercial affair as opposed to more of a closed relationship between aristocratic benefactors and the musicians, or in other cases, the church and musicians. And one of the first musicians in this age of commercial music who used his fame in order to advance his ideas was Richard Wagner. Not only was he one of the most influential and important musicians of all time, but his essay writings proved very influential. Now, a lot of what he wrote about was music, and if you're going to read about music, you're probably well off reading from one of the most important musicians of all time. But he also made a lot of comments about society, sociology, and so forth. Some people loved what he had to say, some people didn't love what he had to say, but the point is, he said it. He wrote it technically, but he was a very gregarious type. He had a lot to say. Maybe if he was around today, they'd say, shut up and write your operas. But others would say, yeah, go, Richard, go, say more. So, what goes around does come around. There's nothing new under the sun. It's the delivery methods and the way that they're received that tend to change in very significant ways. There were people who didn't necessarily use their fame as a musical or political soapbox, but still had a lot of very interesting ideas in the realm outside of music. Alexander Scriabin in the late 19th and early 20th century is someone that I'd really put in that category. But when we really want to talk about musicians that were stridently political, you almost have to fast forward, not a long way, but to the age of recorded music, when recorded music is becoming something that is ubiquitous. And someone like Woody Guthrie, for instance, everything he sung was political, and everything he said, even when he wasn't holding his guitar, was political. Now, that signifies two things. One, the folk tradition of many cultures, not all, but many folk musical traditions carried on from where ancient poetry left off as a means of communication, delivering information, delivering opinion. And this was the case for hundreds of years in pre-literate or semi-pre-literate peasant societies. A folk singer would be a way not just of entertaining the uneducated classes in a society, but he would also convey to them information, some of the information more sort of pedestrian or even more guttural than they would get in churches during the homily, the sermon, which was where people would go for the more enlightened delivery of information. Now, obviously, this trend in the 1930s collided with the trend of recorded music. Recorded music obviously gave musicians more of a direct contact with those not in their immediate physical vicinity than most things that came before it, minus except for things like player instruments, the player piano, player organs, which date back to the 19th century. But now that we're able to buy a piece of, in the 30s, shellac and later tape and vinyl, and take someone like Woody Guthrie home with us, we necessarily feel more of a personal connection with the person, even though we've never met him. And chances are that you will never meet him, at least not in the context of a personal acquaintanceship. But nevertheless, that was there. And so we get this notion in our heads that once you feel that a musical artist is more intimate than someone more distant, one would naturally become more curious about their ideas outside of their music and lyrical talents. And fast forwarding even more, we can see that this reality could manifest itself into a kind of broader trend. And something that really lit the fire under that trend was the Vietnam War, because several things were going on at once. It was a golden age for the music industry. Singles were selling, LPs were selling, FM radio was beginning, AM radio still going strong. The economy was good, which meant people bought really expensive hi fi systems and they loved showing them off, they loved playing them. Music was becoming not only more intimate to us than ever before, but people were investing in the music. And when you invest in the equipment and the record collections and the FM receivers to have better access and more sonically pleasant ways of experiencing the music, this only enhances this idea that we want to form this personal connection with the musicians. And various social events of the 60s got the musicians to reciprocate. There was the fact that there was a folk revival in the early 60s, which is a musical genre that lends itself to polemicism. There was the fact that a lot of young people had very strong views about things like the war in Vietnam, like civil rights and other things, and musicians were there to express that. There was the fact that, unlike in previous and later epochs, at least in the US, the First Amendment was in pretty decent shape. Not perfect, but decent shape in the 1960s, which gave these composers and these singers, these songwriters, a lot of leeway, whether J. Edgar Hoover and his high heels liked it or not. And so we have several things going on here. We have people feeling more intimate with musicians than ever before, more relatable to musicians than ever before. We have an expanding media where musicians now have the opportunity to go on at length about their non musical views. Think things like the Dick Cavett show, things like the Parkinson show, even things like Johnny Carson, which was a bit more middle of the road than the more sort of pie in the sky, highbrow Ivy League Dick Cavett. But when all of these things are combined, there was unprecedented, for the time, unprecedented access to the thoughts of musicians. And people tended to pay attention to them because musicians were no longer the people confined to the back of the church where the organ is, no longer confined to the great home of an aristocrat who probably wouldn't like the musicians saying much unless he was told to say it, and no longer as distant as they were from an era when you couldn't take the musicians home from you. Musicians at this time really mattered, so much so that Richard Nixon famously tapped the phone of John Lennon. Now, a lot of musicians had even more radical views than John Lennon, but John Lennon was considered influential. That's pretty big. He was a musician, but the president of the United States found him to be a potential troublemaker for his policy making and his political campaigns. Very, very interesting indeed. Now, let's fast forward a bit further. The Vietnam War ends, the civil rights era becomes a settled matter of law, the radicalism dies down. But people still were interested in what musicians had to say. Frank Zappa, for instance, in the 1980s had a lot to say, but the news cameras were generally accommodating. CNN and the networks were really curious about hearing what he had to say, and when he was on, people wanted to listen. He did drive ratings up, and of course, he was very articulate. Now, this was a time when there were still larger than life musical superstars. Think Michael Jackson. If Michael Jackson had said a lot about the political campaigns of the 1980s, it I think that you could have logically said that this may have shifted the campaign. Certainly in 1988, which was much closer than 1984. That was the age of the musical superstar. Now, let's fast forward to where we are today. So, today we have more access to musicians than ever before because of social media. And one would think that because of that, we might be more interested than ever in what they have to say about general matters. This does not seem to be the case. What is the case, and what in many ways bodes well for music as a lifestyle and as an art form, is that when musicians have a lot to say about music, we are very, very curious about what they have to say. Biographies about music, YouTube channels with bots reading news stories about music get loads of hits, and most importantly, because it's the most authentic thing I'll mention, people like Rick Beato, who over the last 2 or 3 years has really made interviews a kind of centerpiece of his channel, those get a lot of views. In many cases, more views than the sort of dying legacy media outlets. And what this proves is that people don't necessarily want to hear a 3-minute network soundbite driven story about which musician slept with who and which things were put up whose nose. They want to hear a long form interview, sometimes over an hour, between Rick Beato and some of the greatest musicians of all time, talking about music with a musician. Between the subject of the interview and the interviewer being a musician, all of the non-musical content gets sucked out of the air. It's that great sucking sound that Ross Perot talked about in 1992. So it's not that people have fallen out of love with musicians talking. Quite the contrary. But they do seem to have fallen out of love with hearing what musicians have to say about non musical matters. John Lennon and his famous interviews on Monday Night Football in the 70s, before obviously his death was announced on that show, it was a unique moment in time. And while obviously musicians like movie stars and streaming stars are still celebrities, the diversity of the marketplace when it comes to the consumption of art and entertainment has made it so that our relationship with musicians has almost plateaued. We have even more access to them and their views and their personal lives than we did when we could watch them doing a relatively extended interview on the Dick Cavett show or on something like that. And yet it seems that we've reached a saturation point. We no longer care all that much about what a musician has to say about non-musical matters. Even when Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris, the polls didn't really change. And when the election came, it obviously didn't matter all that much. Um, and you could say the same about Beyonce. There are many such examples. Now, who was the Taylor Swift of the 1980s? Well, that would have been Michael Jackson. If Michael Jackson, like I said something about the 1988 election, I think it could have shifted it. And imagine if George Bush went on TV and said, I hate Michael Jackson. That would have cost him votes. Now, Donald Trump went on Truth Social, his social media platform, and said, I hate Taylor Swift in all big letters. It didn't really matter. And one could say that maybe because people care more about the issues in politics and less about the celebrity. I actually think the truth isn't that sophisticated in terms of the political meaning. I think it's actually quite sophisticated, though, when we think of where music sits in our society. And I think that it shows that music is now something that is increasingly about dressing up. It's about a lifestyle. It's about an accompaniment to another form of stimuli, another form of entertainment. It's accompanying a TikTok video, for instance, rather than the main attraction. When in the age of Michael Jackson, people would put on Thriller back to back, side A, side B, and they would just listen. They would then, because it was such a beloved album, they would then probably sit down and they would listen a second time. When people are listening to the popular music of the 21st century, I don't know if they're giving it that much undivided attention. They're certainly giving it attention. Taylor Swift's streaming numbers and Taylor Swift's ability to sell out large arenas absolutely backs that fact up. But I don't think that in terms of that intimate listening experience to a recording, that people are necessarily sitting down and doing what they would have done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, which is sit down and just listen. And what this means is that even though we have the ability to be incredibly intimate, or let's call it a faux intimacy, a digital intimacy, we're able to achieve that with these artists, but we're not really that interested in it. It's a bit like our relationship with artists in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in terms of this intimacy was like a couple who were madly in love. Now it's a bit like someone who, like Hugh Hefner, has a lot of options. I really don't care that much about what Taylor Swift has to say. I like her music. I go to her concerts. I mean, I'm not a huge fan personally. I'm playing a role. I'm being an actor now. Ooh, spooky. So someone would say, yeah, I like Taylor Swift. I've gone to some of her concerts. I like the TikTok videos that feature her music, but I also love this Kick streamer, this TikTok streamer, this guy on Twitter, this old person that makes funny animal noises and runs around with his dogs on Facebook. I really like watching this obscure sport for Japan on this rare streaming network. I like arguing about about football with Stephen A. Smith on his YouTube. I have all of these other things. So we've gone from being in a rather committed pseudo intimate relationship with these musicians to being somewhat more of a menage a trois, as some arrogant people might say. And so, even though we have the ability to be more intimate than before, we have less of a desire to. And I don't actually think that's limited to the music industry. Think of an industry that begins with P and ends with pornography that we might not be allowed to talk about here, but we're talking about it from a sociological basis. People have more access to that than ever before. They have more options for titillation. But Frank Zappa once again is proven correct. The P pornography that people see online isn't an expression of lust or even really of sexuality. It's an expression of titillation. And when there's titillation, there's necessarily a lack of intimacy. It's the facade without the structure, it's the icing without the cake. That's not a double entendre, by the way. And the same is kind of true with music. Just as people will watch that stuff and they might only need 2 to 3 minutes to get what they need out of it, some might need more, some might need less. Who am I to judge? But people have a similar relationship with music. Oh, I heard the first 45 seconds of that Taylor Swift song. I'm switching over. Not because you don't like the song, not because you're bored of the song, but because in those 45 seconds it did for me, the hypothetical listener, what I needed it to do. Again, that's titillation, not intimacy, because people are thinking of music and what it can do for them in the way they think of that other stuff that I already mentioned 3 times. So I'm going to get so censored. I'm going to get censored like never before. I'm going to get censored in ways that you've never seen. But that's okay because I'm willing to make a sacrifice for you, the audience. By the way, if you want to lessen the burden of that self sacrificial censoriousness, you can also buy a membership to this channel and you'll get extra perks, including getting to know me up close and personal. Not that way, not that way, you sick people. Again, must we really take everything so seriously? And you can also now send super chats. So anyway, the commercial's over. Back to the stream. So that's the state of music today and our relationship with it. It's not that we don't like music, it's that we don't love music. And even if we do love music, we are not in love with it. Where people, let's say, imagine the stereotypical young person in 1973 listening to Dark Side of the Moon for the first time. That is an intimate experience. Listening to all of the nuance, all of the interesting sounds, all of the compelling chords, all of the interesting lyrics. That is an intimate experience. Listening to Miles Davis Bitches Brew for the first time, an intimate experience. Let's move on to the next decade, Straight Outta Compton by NWA. That is an intimate experience because you are glued to those lyrics, the likes of which many people around the world, and frankly, most people outside of Black urban communities in North America had never heard. And it was fascinating. You didn't want to turn it off. That is an intimate experience. Same with Thriller, same with so many albums. And the intimacy just isn't there in music. The titillation is, and maybe that is why we don't really care what these people have to say as much about music. The intimacy is gone, and therefore the attraction to one's opinion is gone. Musicians today are no longer my first, my last, my everything, as Barry White said. Now it's just, oh, I like a bit of this and I like a bit of that. It's the difference between fast food and fine dining. Both provide sustenance, both could hypothetically keep you from starving, but they satisfy different types of nutritional desire. One is, I want something that's tasty but unsophisticated and that can be enjoyed quickly. And the other is about the fully fledged experience, the dining room, the way the waiter is dressed, the way the tablecloth is laid out, as opposed to a guy brings it to you on the motorcycle and you eat half of it walking down the street. That's the difference. And I'm not passing judgment on that musically one way or another. What I'm doing is I'm identifying our relationship as music consumers with the artists and why in an age where from a technological point of view, extreme intimacy is so possible, and yet we're not as interested in what Taylor Swift had to say about Kamala Harris as we were about what Wagner said about Germany in his essays in the 19th century, or about what Woody Guthrie had to say about America in the age of FDR, or what John Lennon had to say about world peace and socioeconomics in the 60s and 70s, or what Frank Zappa had to say about censorship in the 1980s. It's because while musical figures like Taylor Swift and Beyonce can still be larger than life, the portion of the amount of our headspace that we're willing to devote to music as an intimate act is decreasing. We're still very interested in it and for the music in and of itself, which is why Rick Beato's interviews, as I said, are so popular. And yes, if he interviewed a modern pop star like Taylor Swift about her music and her approaches to music, like it or dislike it, it would, of course, get many views. But when she talks about Kamala Harris, it didn't move the needle. The most popular musician did not get people to change their popular vote. And that has a lot more to do, I think, with how music has changed in terms of its sociological relationship with us than with how politics has changed. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments. Share it around, friends or enemies. A click's a click. As I said, sign up to this channel, buy a membership, do all of that wonderful, happy stuff, and let me know what you think about this topic. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.